Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to FAPS. My name is Anja Skrzypek. I'm Director for Research and Training, and it's my privilege to be an appetizer to what's going to be an intellectual and political delight, having been given a responsibility to say a few words at the very beginning. We are incredibly grateful to FES, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Competence Center on Democracy, and especially Elena Abramowska, who sadly cannot be here, but we will do utmost to represent her as well in set in a couple of minutes for this extraordinary and I would say pioneering project, because I do not believe that something similar exists anywhere else, where we are trying to look at if it's really true that it is the social media that define the preferences and mobilize youth electorates to go to the votes. I think strikingly so, in different statistics, we do see that young people no longer follow the same patterns as not only the it seems that once we have the IT kind of or social media event, my microphone is definitely playing jokes on me. But I suppose it's the theme of the event. You fight against the techniques and you try to change reality as it is. We see very much changing patterns of political participation. And here at FABS, being part of the social democratic family, so the family that very often is described as institutional, old, competent, yes, but perhaps not such a fun and sparkling one. Serves the question, can we figure out the way to use it and to adapt to the circumstances and perhaps even be a pioneer, being the ones being extraordinary once we've done our homework and our lessons. In that sense, we think that while partnering with Democracy Reporting International and DPART, we came up with a fantastic content and that is going to spark a lot of controversies today. In this house, we do believe that there is a difference between knowledge and opinion. Everybody is very opinionated these days, but today we are going to have some knowledge which might contrast your opinions and might take you out of the comfort zone. I think in the previous session that had definitely been the case. So when we saw the midterm review back in June, I think just immediately after the European elections, we've had a lot of striking things like politicians get to sell via social media when they are authentic, but when social democrats are authentic, they are not sellable. So I'm wondering if 3 months later we found the way to change this conundrum and found out the way in which we can be ourselves and still be mobilizing the votes and populations. But I think for me, crucially, this is not just an exercise to look at the social media, analyze what happened, and make ourselves believe in some comfortable truths. I think all of us coming at the end of the super electoral year realize that democracy is under a lot of pressure. Social media is a space where the new borders of pluralism are being defined. When it's being defined, what it means to respect political boundaries, what it means to respect the boundaries of political civilized debate. So I'm very much hoping that though today we are going to look specifically at the country case studies, we are going to look specifically in the communication ahead of the European elections. And after, I think in the larger context, I'm certain that we are going to leave with some very important and motivating lessons to do better beyond the super electoral year, but still for the sake of democracy, especially in Europe, and for the sake of the future populations. Matteo, I am guessing that that's the moment I introduce you both and hand you the floor. Thanks so much for giving me the privilege to kick off start this fantastic meeting. Thank you so much for coming over and staying after lunch for something that is going to be lunch of a fantastic report.
Thank you for that. Let's see if we can live up to the expectation, potentially together with all the speakers and all of you and our shared knowledge as well, based on, of course, what we're going to present in a minute. Maybe one small thing. It seems digital is always first, so you'll find the study online for about 30 minutes already on our webpage, but the printed copies were supposed to be here, and they might still come. You might still walk away with one, but like the printed, it's times of the old, so express delivery to Michael.
Yes, also warm welcome from my side. I'm Michael from the FES Regional Office Democracy of the Future based in Vienna, and I jump in for my colleague Elena, who was the third editor of this report besides us two. Now, let's start. What we will do today, basically, now quickly first outline what is in the report, why we did the report, and how we were actually doing it. And then we both take turns in presenting the main findings of the report, and Matteo finally would outline some implications that we find are interesting to discuss later on the findings have. Now, you wonder probably why is the sandwich on this first slide. And, well, the sandwich was basically a kind of a metaphorical image of what the report contains, so to say, our ingredients of the report. How so? Well, as the title suggests, we wanted to look at the social media strategies of political parties in the European election campaign in a sense of how they try to target young people. But to evaluate the success of these strategies, it only makes sense if you also look of how young people voted in the end, and to get a sense if these strategies actually made a difference in reaching young voters. So this is the meat of our basic report on the media strategies, and the bottom would be the bottom bread would be the voting behaviors, and the top, unintended, not intended, we have on top we have to look at what the concerns actually are young people have going into these elections, and whether the tried targets of the social media strategies actually resonated with those concerns that young people have. Now, why did we do this? Well, we already heard some good arguments, obviously, but not just since the recent annulment of the Romanian election just a week or 10 days ago. On the basis of basically foreign influence via social media, we know that the game for attention for young people happens online, right? It is social media that is, as also other surveys found, that is the primary source of political information for young people. And we also know that far-right parties have been particularly adept at adapting their strategies to this changing social media landscape, and have been in many countries quite successful in mobilizing young people, especially men, for their causes. Now, so that was the why that kind of motivated us to do the report in the first place, and then just quickly the how, without worrying about technical details, where we basically used 3 data sets for the 3 layers of the sandwich. The social media data set stems from the social media monitoring project by our partner, Democracy Reporting International, which also has a representative here for the discussion later. And these the bottom layer now the top layer, so to say, so the behavior data, the concern data comes from our other partner, Dpart, who is also representative here, who did an original survey before the election in several European countries on this. And the bottom layer, so the voting behavior, how they voted, the motivation data comes from the Eurobarometer post-electoral survey published in September 2024. And just to note also, we tried to focus on specific countries since we couldn't cover all of them. And we picked Germany, Sweden, Hungary, and Poland, trying to strike a somewhat geographic balance while accounting that we can't cover all. Now, this is the introduction, and now I hand over to Matteo.
Yes, and I'm gonna walk you through a little bit to the meat, let's say, the core of what we found on social media. So to give you a context, there was this bigger project of our partner, as was mentioned, which collected a lot of posts by political parties, politicians, accounts linked to them, to see how campaigning was being done. That's close to 4,000 posts they collected, and about 10%, to be exact, 390 posts of them we could label as targeting young people. We had a keyword search, elaborate system to identify them, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, like the data. In terms of what we found, let's start with the absolute numbers. Social Democrats were actually those which were most represented in our samples in terms of how much they posted, 132 posts. They were followed by far-right parties at 113 posts, and then all the other party families followed, conservative with 64, with much lower values of absolute numbers. There's also differences in terms of countries that you see behind here of our case study countries. So Hungary having the most posts, followed by Germany, then Poland, and then Sweden. And while some of that might be attributed to how much parties try to target young people, we also have to take into account that how important these platforms are in those countries matter. We know from our own, more or less, it's not that anecdotal experience. If we go into Hungary, we have to consider Facebook also for young people. In most other countries, we might not need to do that. So there's also some of that represented. So and then the last note of caution, everything you're going to see here doesn't mean that this is absolute values. We are not claiming we covered everything. It's an automatic text generated search, etc. So what we'll see is trends. Don't the absolute numbers. Oh, how did that? Cursor still there?
Yes.
Right. So moving on. So because arguably, and I suppose most of you, especially those looking into social media, agree, absolute number of posts doesn't tell you much about what success looks like on social media. The most common thing to do to measure that is to talk about engagement. Engagement is usually measured as a combination of likes and shares and comments. And that really tells you more about, do people actually care about the posts, right? And the results on that are a little bit different from what I just told you about which party families kind of posted a lot. What you see here is that especially far-right parties on average per post had a much higher interaction rate, followed by the Greens, some distance, Greens still high up there, and then all the others much lower. So some early key takeaway of this presentation, therefore, is not about just supplying a lot and talking a lot to young people, also on social media. It's also about how do these messages actually resonate. And of course, we also try to understand a little bit, so why is it then? Why does the far right have this success among young people? And one kind of intuitive thing to do, because we also know from previous research, is to look if negative, toxic content, as the argument often goes, triggers engagement, right? I've just been recently to an event where an MEP who also was shadow on the Digital Services Act put it quite nicely. On social media, you don't get to see what interests you or what you like, you get to see what makes you angry, right? So this is kind of the argument. Does it mean the far right has a lot of engagement? Does it mean they were very negative, very toxic? What you see here would suggest exactly that. Far-right parties are by far quite posting the most negative content, whereas you have the middle group of liberals, conservatives, social democrats, and Greens, much more positive content. Now, unfortunately, and that's probably also due to the size of our data set, we couldn't establish a statistically significant correlation between the two, so that negative content triggers engagement. However, we took a step back to the bigger data set, which has much more posts that I talked to you about in the beginning, which didn't only look at young people though. And there, indeed, our partner DRI looked at if toxicity, and Francesca can maybe elaborate a bit later exactly on that, if that kind of triggers more engagement. And indeed, if you look at more numbers, a bigger data set, general population, you do see this relationship between toxic posts indeed triggering more engagement. There's certainly a lot more to say, especially if you look at the far right, why they're successful in media. I'm not going to say it now. If you're interested, there will be spaces in the discussions later to ask me. If not, then we go somewhere else. Right. Then we also looked into a topical analysis. Don't see the flex, only the anyway. The topic analysis, the automatic text analysis wasn't good enough to kind of give a specific topic. So what we did is literally read all the posts and try to make sense of them on what parties actually talked about. So I give you two examples here, those with the countries where the most posts were posted. And there's also Poland and Sweden. If you have interest in those, we can talk about it later. So on Germany, we saw that content was quite evenly spread in addressing young people between the parties. However, as we see in all the countries, the AfD, the far-right party, by far had the most engagement on their posts targeting young voters. Then other parties, when it comes to content specifically, the CDU, the Conservative Party, was focusing more on what you might call traditional kind of trying to speak to young people. They talked a lot about interrail mobility programs, these kind of classical themes. Let's say the AfD, interestingly enough, was the only party which really portrayed themselves as we are the party of the young people, like we're doing well in the polls. There was regional elections before and that, etc. Of course, combining that with their what you would expect anti-migrant rhetoric, nationalist rhetoric, and also against the media because of specific context at the time in Germany on some scandals. Greens focused on mobility, focused on obviously climate change, framing that in a way that they were talking about the future implications of future generations of climate change. So they had the link to the young people, also celebrating the lowering of the voting age in Germany from 18 to 16 for the European election, framing that again in this is a chance to shape the European Union in a progressive way. Social Democrats specifically looked at future visions for the European Union, social future visions, and interestingly enough, and I think that goes also beyond just this specific case, where the only one, at least in our data set, pointing a lot to the far right as a danger to democracy, really making that a strong point. Hang on. Hungary, also very interesting. I think the main takeaway here was that with the emergence, and most of you will know of Peter Maiger and the TISA party, so kind of an emerging center-right alternative to Fidesz, if you will, coming up before the European elections. So they were really able to get a lot of engagement. They beat literally all the parties, also in the polls later they were doing well, but also on social media addressing young people in terms of engagement, doing that specifically by challenging the Fidesz, the governing party on national level, on their integrity, on corruption, etc. Other parties had much lower engagement. Other topics that mattered generally was the economy, that was very strong in Hungary. So you would hear about where the EU allocates funds, about youth unemployment, how the EU is kind of trying to tackle that. You also had the topic of women's rights being a polarizing one. On the one hand, the Greens and the Social Democrats kind of advocating to support gender equality, and on the other hand, Fidesz, as you may imagine, kind of bringing the narrative of this is all an ideology, etc. Maybe not that surprising. All right, and with that, I think I lead over to you again to contextualize some of that.
Yes, thanks, Matteo. So now we know a bit of how parties try to, like what topics and how the parties try to reach young people on social media during the campaign. But the question now is obviously, did they strike the right tone on topics and also the narrative, and in the end, looking at how people actually voted after all. But let's start with how many of them actually voted, which is, so here you see the evolution of the turnout rate among young people in the past 4 European elections. So on the one hand, you see that turnout amount among the young is consistently about 15 percentage point below the overall turnout. And there's only one exception, that's 2019, where turnout surged to 51% overall for the first time actually in 25 years. So kind of engagement rose in general. And that was back then mostly driven by the younger half and especially also young people in the population. And this year we basically saw a reversal to the mean, again, back to this 15 percentage points gap in turnout among young people. But note, however, the overall turnout stayed the same, right? So it was not an election that generally lacked mobilization back to 2014, but across all age groups, but actually young people not turning out again and being a little bit compensated by all other age groups. Now, looking at our 4 case countries, the picture diverges a bit also when looking just at turnout. So you can already see some regional differences that we have across Europe. So in our 4 countries, turnout dropped the most in Sweden by 30 percentage point, which is a huge drop after the record they had in 2019. In Poland, we have a 10 percentage drop, while both in Hungary and Germany, turnout virtually kind of stayed the same among young people. And you might wonder what drove that huge drop in Sweden. Well, we didn't study the 2019 election, right? But we know that it was more than this one, an election where the climate issue and mobilization among young people surrounding the climate protests, you might remember this labeling of a green wave, likely played a role in this record turnout. And basically, the 2024 was a reverse to that normal low level of turnout. Now, before we go into the topics in terms of topical motivations young people have, at least going into election, let's look at the general motivations of young people to vote in the European election. Well, first thing that strikes is that here, and you might not see, is that voting is obviously less of a habit among people, as evidenced by this big gap in the response. You always vote, which is not surprising, right? That since electoral habits are in general just more fluid when you're in their early 20s, when most people are just not have settled or still quite mobile. On the other hand, you see that this understanding that voting is an important or even civic duty is not that different among young people than overall. And also support for the European matters, where you see that in favor of the European policies, and that kind of gives you an idea that there is a sense of belonging to the European ideas among young people, and a bit higher than among the general population. And the most optimistic bit in this graph is that the share of young people thinking voting elections actually allows them to make a change is higher among young than the overall population. So there is this, people are optimistic, they want to engage and also still voting, some of them, but the disappointment might come later in your life. Maybe it didn't deliver what they kind of were hoping that it promised. Now, if you go a bit deeper and you look how young people choose political parties in elections and the European elections in particular, that picture also mirrors the overall motivations in mostly, again, with that exception of you just always vote the same party, which is not the case for young people. But top are the issues, that actually the issues and contents that party positions that are proposed. And if they're in line with your own ideas and values, then you are low likely to pick this party. So this gives you that idea that it's still proposals and positions that matter to some degree. But these negative motivations, such as avoiding the success of another party or not liking any other party, are actually not that prominent as you might think in the overall idea. So if you think about this, focusing on the danger of the others might not be that helpful, which you saw in one of the slides before. Now, so we know that proposals still matter. So what are those? So what are the key topics, key issues that we found in the data set? Now, the number one here is actually economy, and then security, followed then by climate change. And this is a bit different than 2019, that our climate was much higher. And in many countries, actually top issue number one among the young. So the issues actually also shifted, obviously, and we have seen a lot of crisis in that time, right? From Corona pandemic to Ukraine war to cost of living crisis, especially. So that there's a shift, especially towards economic concerns and security concerns, is not as surprising. That it also affected young people who, in all of these crises, actually have been affected a lot as well. And we saw it in the data sets. So there's only a couple of things. So this kind of mirrors these overall developments that just happened across all age groups. The only big difference in terms of the overall population is that we have is in education and also migration. So education matters more to young people, kind of obvious in the sense it affects them more, but also that it's still an issue, and migration less of one. So the whole talk about that, when at least reaching young people, might not be that helpful. And here, which is not seen in the graph, is that these things are actually also very geographically differently divided, in a sense that economic concerns and security concerns are especially concerned about in Poland and Hungary, where these more non-material issues like climate are much more higher among young people in Sweden and Germany. Now, so topics matter, but so does the mood. That's kind of this is also something you probably are familiar with, in the sense that the overall mood among the general population since 2019 has changed. We're living in a time where people are very pessimistic about the future, and that also includes young people. Now, on one hand, you see there's a slight difference, that the share of very negative perceptions about the social and economic situation in their respective countries is higher among the general population. So there's 25%. How much is it? 20% who have very negative perceptions about the future, and only 10% very negative among young. So, and it's very, but overall you have a very high share of negative perceptions, and that has grown over time, which is not the case in the past. But at the same time, also the very strong optimists are higher among the young. So it kind of mirrors what we heard before. that they have this feeling of it can get better, it can make a difference. It makes sense to also participate, and possibly the realizations about what happens then afterwards in real life might only come later when you're above 25. Interesting also here, which is not in the graph, is it's very important to differentiate. This is the perceptions of the general situation. When you're asking them on their personal situation, in the sense of, are you optimistic about your personal prospects in the future? It's much, much more positive among all age groups, also young people. So there's actually a divergence happening that while everybody says the countries go down the drain, so to say, they still think for themselves it's going to be fine, and they also deem their own situation often as quite relatively okay. There's some differences that, especially in Eastern Europe, they also often tie this to then the desire to migrate, mostly emigrate for economic reasons, which might change now given the economic crisis in many of the core countries in Europe. And finally, we want to show you, at least for my part, is this bit. You might already be familiar with. It's kind of a complicated graph, but it shows basically the share of support of far-right statements and positions among different party families, which it's for obvious reasons that among the voters of the far right, there's a high support among for far-right positions. So they vote those parties for their contents and are convinced by them, but that share among others. So if you ask liberals, are you agreeing with some of the far-right positions, also increased. And this is something that really changes a bit of the landscape, so to say. So the kind of change in discourse and also agreement to certain positions, especially when it comes to issues dear to the far right, such as immigration, has been increasing across all party families. And this gives you an idea of, while they're really good at mobilizing the voters they have right now, they might actually get more potential voters given this development, if this is not reversed. Now, how this might be done is now up to Matteo.
Only to me, of course. No, absolutely not. So what I'm going to do here, also for sake of time, is run you through a couple of what we think are key implications. Of course, as Anja introduced, we are a social democratic think tank, so we're looking at these implications through that lens. But of course, many of them I think will also be relevant for generally for democratic institutions, also some other parties. I'm going to start with this other complicated graph. So, as you mentioned, Anja, maybe Social Democrats are not known to be the party of the young, so they might as well, if I'm going to be polarizing a bit, ask themselves, wow, why should we even care? Why should we address them at all? Well, that graph might give an answer to that. What you see here, it's from a previous study we've done a couple of months ago, is basically asking people, how much do you like this party family? It's not going to be, will you vote for them? It's like, do you think there are sympathies for them? And what you see here, that 60% of young people, it's again our age group until 25, say yes, we do like the Social Democrats at 60%. It's one of the most liked parties. Doesn't mean, of course, that they will vote for them, but what it might mean is that they will listen at least if parties have something to say. So I guess the point here is there's an audience as well for messages if you bring them the right way. Then a second point, I think, which is important more broadly, is also strategically thinking. Of course, there is this argument in research around young people that the young years, so we're talking late teens, mid-20s, are part of the formative years, also politically speaking. So this is where you kind of build a political identity, form your opinions. Of course, they might change still through the later years of your life, but they're less likely to, right? So there's, to a degree, locked in. That's at least what academic research would suggest. So there's a strategic interest for Social Democrats, or any party really, to address young people while they're young, because it might help you in the long run. And a similar argument can be made about them actually turning out. So there's also research on showing that, especially for your first election, if this is kind of a positive experience, so you feel like you're voting and you really want to, and you feel some efficacy, like I made a change or I had a good feeling, this might actually help you, or might be a predictor for you to turn out throughout your life more than others who didn't have that experience at all. So I guess the point here is, helping young people to vote and have a good experience and really think they know what they're voting for, there is a point, because yeah, I guess as people all trying to defend also liberal democracy in these times, there's a point of having as many people vote as you can imagine. A second point is what to do about what you're actually going to say. So more the topics that we're not yet into the social media bit, which I come to in a bit later. So what we've learned from Micha is that economy matters, and we didn't kind of just show you all the details, but also welfare matters. So people care about unemployment benefits, they care about healthcare. So it's not the economy broadly. And of course, Social Democrats are known for that. It's their core issues. So you just need to also focus on these issues, at least our data would suggest, rather than other things, and jump on a train of kind of talk about migration all the time. So, but of course, topics are not enough, and that plays into what Michael said about the mood. There is a fairly negative mood, so you need to somehow address this general feeling of malaise by providing some type of hopeful vision, which also can deliver some actionable results, so it feels achievable to young people, like we can get there, and also inclusive as I'm part of it, right? So this is another important point. And then we are going to the things you probably shouldn't be doing, which is again also found to be in the data. You should probably not be talking and copy pasting things that the far right is doing. Probably a lot of research would suggest that for most people, especially on the left side of the spectrum, but also center right, is not going to help you actually win votes. So just don't do it. And of course, from a principled view, you should also not. Then coming to the social media strategy. Of course, this is open for discussion also with some of you who might be also experts on this topic. What we found here is what might help is adopt a bit more of a Social Democrats, especially a participatory communication model. What that means is kind of captured well in one sentence, which is try to communicate from one to many more concretely. You try to build a community, you try to kind of share content with young people, have them create content, spread it from their accounts, etc. It is something the far right is very good at. They build their communities, so we know that works. And you don't need to adapt any of the narratives while still saying, okay, we could do more of that. I'm not saying it's not done, but I think there could be more of that. Then, of course, what Anja also pointed out, there needs to be some relatable messages. So addressing young people directly, trying to be authentic, providing some clear takeaways. Just one example from one of the quotes I saw on a politician visiting a mental health institution, just posting about that. Why don't you then just say something about the supporting structures that are out there for young people who can help you, then policies that you are kind of proposing on addressing the mental health challenge? It's just one example, like concrete, be concrete. What do I get from that? Avoiding toxic rhetoric is something I said. I'm repeating it here, but what's important, it doesn't mean that you can't also polarize to a degree. For Social Democrats now, the obvious thing would be to polarize around inequality, for example, about people who have too much versus people who don't have a lot. So if you know that social media algorithms kind of reward some of that polarizing content, then go at least on the core message and try to polarize there rather than putting everything on minority groups. That would be one thing. But of course, we all know that's probably not going to be enough, and there's going to be structural challenges, and that, I guess, can be summarized under like the term of level playing field, right? We know there's this kind of inconvenient connection between, on the one hand, social media algorithm rewarding, as we also said, toxic content, and then being a supplier of that content, which just by the nature they supply that, right? They spread hate. So of course that's a match made in hell, I guess. So you want to kind of level that out, and how are you going to level it out? I suppose also for the European Union in the next 5 years, by using the tools very consequently that have been just recently designed, and we can talk about it more later with also some of the speakers who have more detailed knowledge on that, like the Digital Services Act and some of the articles kind of pointing out that social media platforms, especially the big ones, have to assess their risks, have to act on that, and otherwise will be in some form or less punished for not doing it. So we really need to try to create an environment where a more civil discourse also online is possible. It's a huge task, I know, but without tackling this, all the other things I said, they can help, and they will probably address a degree of the challenges for social democrats and others to communicate on social media, but they won't solve it all. You also need the structural things. That's it. I would take a couple of questions, maybe 3 or 4, and don't worry, there will be much more space also in the next segment to discuss. And if you have more questions to ask. Yes.
All right. So I was saying that I had a question about the data regarding engagement, and I was wondering whether the engagement, if a closer look was given to the kind of engagement that was under these posts, if it was people supporting the message in the post or just fighting in the comments. I wanted simply to know if there was if particular attention was given to the content of the engagement. Thank you.
Because you mentioned at the end the regulation of algorithm. There was this change of political content algorithm on Instagram, for example. Do you see any of this in the result, or was it an issue in the research? Because I'm the president of Jeff Europe, the Young European Federalists, and we see that when it's more political, it gets less reach. And I was wondering how maybe political parties have gone around this. Maybe it's easier for the far right. I don't know.
So I wanted to ask, you mentioned that it wouldn't be a good strategy for more progressive parties to implement similar strategies as the far-right parties, because that would disencourage the progressive voters. But isn't it the point to actually encourage those who vote for far-right anyway to vote for the more progressive? So implementing similar strategy wouldn't influence them in a good way, in a sense?
So I'm going to do it. I'm going to maybe address one of the questions. One, I'm going to hand to you on engagement, and one, Micha, is a lot of his research also is on the far right side. So on the algorithms of Instagram, I'm not extremely familiar with that. Maybe Francesca can also address that. But on the question of how political parties try to get around it, well, all I have to say is Romania. So, I mean, this is a different platform, so I'm not specifically knowledgeable about the Instagram algorithm, but what you saw there is that, and this is what also we saw, for example, we did another TikTok analysis, it was a spin-off, only on the German elections. So what especially far right is pretty good in, and that's not only Romania, but also for the German part of the European elections, is have other people who are not labeled, I'm a politician, I'm number one in the list for the AfD, Maximilian Krah in this instant, but actually have others, they call it kind of the army, post in your name, your hashtag, etc., spread hate information, whatever you might call it, in your name. So yes, it will probably limit those who actually have the name to post these things and might limit the reach. Okay, then you get others. And I was talking about this in addressing this one too many more. Others can post on that content, try to engage voters, whereas you, as somebody running for members of a European Parliament, might not be able to. So doesn't fully answer the technical bit of the question, which I'm not super familiar with. Maybe then we go to the second one on the engagement, because you, as analyzing the data much deeply on this.
Yes, so I'm from Democracy Reporting International. We're in charge of conducting data analysis, and basically when we're talking about engagement, we usually refer to average engagement of both considering likes, comments, and shares. So actually, it's not that easy to understand that it was a positive or supporting engagement, because of course that means we just see reaction from people. Of course, if you isolated just the likes, that you can assuming that it's a supporting a post, but of course if you are in terms of comments, in terms of share, it can also means that this particular topic raised a conversation, a discussion, and potentially even violent discussion around that. So around the topics, for example, we did engagement analysis by topic. So first, and I'm also I'm referring to a broader project of data analysis, which is not involved, just involved the youth voters. So we isolated first all the topics, and then we perform engagement analysis based on that, also to see which kind of which was the most important drivers as a topics to attract engagement. And of course, one of the main points that maybe we will discuss even later about toxic content, that was actually where we see the difference in how much their ability to attract engagement compared to non-toxic. But I'm sure that will be space to talk about it more later. And regarding the algorithms on Meta specifically, let's not forget that Meta announced, starting from 2019, I think, their intention to progressively reduce the political risk on the platforms. And they progressively said, we support that, and we are extending this policy over and over, even to threats and other services on Reels. So it's kind of expected, I think. There's also to be discussed, in terms of freedom of speech, and I don't want to say censorship, but a policy that clear also has an impact of what we actually can see, can receive by the platforms. Thank you.
Just to make sure I got your question right, was it that who we should target among the young people? Yeah, got it. Well, three things that we found in other projects where we looked at far right rhetoric and far right voting behaviors in the past already. One is that, well, what we should understand when you try as one party to convince voters of another party to vote for you, is that voters actually, and that's true for young voters as well, they vote different parties for different reasons. So if you want to give them the same reason or the same offer, also in the same rhetoric, or so to say, the credibility in terms of that this is going to be believed by those voters is quite low, because people understand the core ideology and also expectation they have from different voters. So, for instance, voters, when you look at far right voters, it's like they expect them to be radical, so to say, and they expect them to say things that others might not have been saying. They might have been disappointed, for instance, from social democratic parties, because they expected them to deliver on social and economic promises which might not have been materialized in that particular instance. So there's a complete different reason of why they were initially convinced to vote for progressive parties than they will be convinced to vote now for far-right parties. So when you try to target specific groups, we usually differentiate between, you have to understand the core voters of each party, which is a very ideological core in a sense. They are following the values and also are very strong on, I will always vote for this party. And then you find out that, okay, typical far-right voters are voters with very strong anti-immigrant attitudes, with a tendency to be less likely in support of democracy, to be not in favor of gender equality. So very strong, typical far-right voters. And if what often happens is, okay, if those are the voters, should we try to appeal to them? But what you forget is they're only as strong because they are already, this is the core of the voter, but what they achieve to do is actually address a certain periphery of the voter potential. We saw how big voter potentials are in that graph before, in the sense that these are not voters who are core voters, but actually are addressed by a certain typical thing that are salient right now for them. For instance, economic concerns for their jobs or for their personal, for their future in general. And the far right narrative to this is to say, this is why this happens, your concerns are valid because of too many immigrants in your country, for instance. But the answer, if you say the same thing, they will most likely be invalidated that the far right was always right in saying this, if you can't offer a certain different answer to this, that actually certain other policies might help you, be it minimum wage or something else. So if you don't get this right, you usually don't have the effect of gaining voters from the other side and as easily. So that would be the shortish answer.
Let's maybe jump into our panel, which is not a panel because the speakers are spread out across our nice table setup here, and then we can discuss further, and any other questions you might have also to the study, whatever comes to mind can be raised there. So we have with us today 4 fantastic speakers. Among them, Bilana Zirakova, the European Youth Coordinator, maybe the women in Brussels knowing best about youth policy from a transversal angle, because that's really your role, right? To know what all the institutions are doing and kind of also connect the pieces and help them connect with each other. Then we have with us Lauren Mason, who is a representative of the European Youth Forum. She works as a policy and advocacy manager there, and specifically focusing on democracy, and I may say until very recently also a strong digital angle. We have with us Nela Eilers from DPART, so one of the co-authors also of one of the chapters that were presented earlier. She's a research fellow there, and DPART focuses especially on political participation. And now the system was difficult for the surname. I hope I get it right. We have with us Francesca Giannacini, is that? Close. Who's a research associate at Democracy Reporting International, who also contributed a lot to this report. And what I would like to do is actually talk about 3 topics. Let's see if we get through all 3 of them. And since this is not a panel per se, I'll just ask the participant to give like a quick input and then bring you in with your questions, with your comments, etc. And the first topic I'd like to start with is participation, and later, just so you have the expectations on it, we will also talk about policies more specifically. So on participation, I would like to start with you, Ilana. We talked a lot about political parties now, but of course you are mainly representing European institutions. So I'm wondering also, having seen the data and of course closely studied also the post-election surveys, I'm sure on young people, and also seeing the drop in turnout, what did you learn from these elections in terms of also social media outreach? Maybe what are some of the lessons learned? What didn't go well? I mean, we can certainly not attribute all the decline in voter turnout among the young to social media. I'm not claiming that, but is there any reflection points on, okay, we did some things well, others not so sure, also looking forward, what can we do better?
Thank you for the question, and thank you to FEPS and your partners for the invitation, but also for this research, because I have to be honest, I'm here, even if I'm on the panel, to learn primarily, because we have to draw some conclusions from the results of the last elections. I don't think we are there yet. So this study is really contributing to the topic. In April this year, just before the elections, also because we knew already from the past that young people and many other voters really make up their mind whether even to vote in the last minute, almost, sometimes literally in the last days. We had the European Youth Week, and also with our partners, the European Forum and other organizations like Jeff Europe and others. And there we had a big event in April in the Parliament's hemicycle. And what we did there, instead of Slido using these techniques, is to ask the young people to vote actually in the hemicycle as the MEPs would do it. We had some questions for them. And of course, one of the questions that we asked was, do you intend to vote? And we were very pleased that something like, we had maybe 600 young people in the room, 90% of them plus said yes. And this, in a way, confirmed other pre-election surveys where, of course, the percentage was much lower, something like 64% of young people intending to vote. And then we know what happened. We have seen the drop. So this was quite of a shock, I have to say. I don't think that it was expected, because when I look at this slide, even those 4 elements, I can give examples on each of these things that we do well, and we have done all institutions together, starting from Together EU, participatory communities, etc., etc. So that's why it's. I just want to preface to say that it's important that we learn about this and analyze it very well. Another thing then, just going maybe straight to your questions on participation, for us, we think that the traditional participation, whether it's, involvement in politics, voting, etc., and the non-traditional go hand in hand. And I'm sure others would agree as well that if young people are active and engaged citizens and learn to express their opinions and create many actions, even volunteering, just trying to be engaged and making a difference in the world, I think this is also the young people that go to vote. So these two things, the so-called conventional or an unconventional, traditional, non-traditional, that doesn't matter, participation, are linked together. This is why one of the biggest finding for us is that we have to really invest in the engagement, in the empowerment of young people. And maybe linked to a second thing is that even if these campaigns continue, something 4 or 5, maybe a bit longer months before elections, to lay the ground for this, it's not 4 or 5 months of work. So it is very erroneous, and that to kind of keep it for just think about young people just before the elections. So that's why we have to really, like, the 4 or 5 years before it, and not only just continuously invest in this, so that we can expect different results in the 4 or 5 months before the elections. There are many other learning points. I think on communication, I completely agree with that we cannot just employ some of these tactics by far-right parties on social media. We shouldn't do that, your third bullet here. However, I still think that there are some learnings point there, even in terms of just generally the usage of social media. What you said, when you post content, not just reporting on who you met with the photo, but just on some education or something and actionable points for the people to do, etc., we can definitely take into account, I think, and that will make a meaningful change in how we communicate with young people. One other thing that I want to mention and just stop there maybe for now is that we think that, of course, the social media and all this did play an impact. But for us, what we see is that the offline engagement with young people is probably even more important. I mean, you may win some likes and comments and shares online, which not always would translate in whatever behavior offline. You see what I mean? And so in most of our actions and activities, we do prioritize in-person, live engagement with young people, whether it's in the EU Youth Dialogue, which we have across all EU countries, and there we really prioritize debates, discussions like this one, young people getting together, because I think if you are about to win the hearts and minds of people, you don't do it online, or at least it's very difficult. So also because when young people meet and they connect with each other, they learn, and there are many other benefits. So this is one thing that the results maybe from this, even if there was a lot of social media, is not changing for us how we want to prioritize actions for.
I take from what you say that it's important, and this is also in the report, we didn't mention it, to combine this very long-term vision and trying to engage with also the short-term push in the end, because we know they decide late, vote, and whom to vote. Both is true. But still, you need to lay the ground. I also take offline and online needs to be connected. Both is important, and then there can always be improvement in how we communicate more. There's a better takeaway. I take that straight to Lauren, to you, asking you kind of the same question, like what have you learned? But of course, you have a slightly different perspective, representing kind of the biggest umbrella organization advocating for young people's interests in the EU bubble, let's say. And you're also a member-based organization. So what have you heard from your members and their efforts to reach out? What went well? What didn't work well? What were some takeaways from your perspective?
Thanks very much for the invitation and for the initiative as well of producing this great study. I think 3 points. The first is, like Biljana, we were also a bit shocked and disappointed by the young turnout, by the lower turnout of young voters. we weren't necessarily expecting. I think there's something to be said about the appeal of politics in its current form, this kind of dry, stiff impression that some of the established parties give. And that coupled with the kind of number of young candidates that are out there. So we know that young voters find younger candidates more appealing. And we also know that younger candidates are often put in unelectable positions, bottom of the list, or not put in seats that we know are electable. And actually 5 countries currently don't have any MEPs under 35, which the second point on what your report calls kind of lack of coherent messaging, I see as this kind of lack of vision. And it might tie into some of the points you raised about like, why is the far right putting forward appealing messages? So on topics like housing, we saw that the far right was jumping on this in many countries, particularly in the Netherlands, for example. And the solutions that they give, which are often, you can't access housing because there are too many migrants, are obviously, or I think in this room, obviously not the right, the right analysis, but they are some of the few parties that are talking about that really openly. So whilst we definitely shouldn't mimic the discourse or the actions of the far right, I think there's a question about recognizing that some of the topics they're raising might be the right topics. Another point I think that we tend to fall into in some academic circles is being a little bit snobbish about young people's interaction with social media. So the reality is that a lot of young people get their information, political information or otherwise, from social media, and that per se is not a bad thing, right? It can be a very democratic, open space, accessible for young people in rural communities. And I think the question is how we make sure that content that's on those platforms is good quality, engaging, creative, informative. And we have lots of good examples from youth organizations who've actually used social media in a very powerful way for elections, in putting across information campaigns, get out the vote, analyzing the manifestos of different political parties. So I think it's about how to make sure that information cuts. Which brings me to my third point, which is really more on the kind of digital side. And we talked about this kind of toxic content. And I would distinguish, I think, between provocative content and toxic content, because content can be a bit provocative, engaging, elicit reactions without immediately being toxic. And there's a role, I think, for regulators as well. For example, the DSA foresees a third-party recommender system, means basically a different algorithm to show content that you're seeing in your feed. And I think that's an area that has, if it's implemented correctly and followed up on properly, has potential to be trying to bring different content into young people's feeds. So yeah, sort of mixed. There's things to be wary of, but I think kind of castigating social media as the problem is not helpful.
Very interesting. I think one point, just very quickly, that you mentioned on housing. So I kept saying, Michael kept saying, don't try to go also into the issues that are in political science, you say, owned by another party, like anti-migrant discourse, for many reasons, but also probably it's not going to help you, even if you do, even if principled, you shouldn't maybe. But what you should be doing is try to at least own the ones that you're known for, housing being, for example, a social issue, because otherwise you're leaving it to those who can expand. So, and then when it comes to the difference between provocative and toxic, I think that's the perfect segue to you, Francesca, whom I wanted to ask a little bit, because you did make that one big part of your analysis of the bigger sample, not only in young people, what toxic content actually is, just defining it for all of us. We talk about what does it really mean, and did it make a difference? I mean, you started talking about it, but did it engage more people if the language was toxic? How did it engage? Whom did it engage? Perhaps who was using it? To just give us go a bit more deeper than what we did in our presentation on that topic.
And thank you for the invitation. I missed this point before. Following up of what Lauren said, I really completely agree on the importance of this differentiated provocative and toxic content, and that leads perfectly to giving it a definition to what toxic is. That of course really depends on what type of model you apply applying in your data analysis. So in this particular context, we applied a model which is called Perspective API, which define toxicity, I took notes, as rude, disrespectful, and unreasonable content that is likely to make someone leave the discussion. And I found it really interesting. Beyond the adjective that define toxic, I also find it kind of interesting, the subjective element of making one leave. By the way, that's my thing. But coming to the finding, we found, considering, as you said, the broader project, a relatively low level of toxicity compared to the overall to overall post, and we are talking about kind of 0.46 level. But is this a good finding? Of course, we are happy, but of course, we need to contextualize these findings, considering that who we were monitoring. We were monitoring public figure, political, CSOs. I mean, any kind of public figures that are really aware how to communicate online and how could be the possible legal repercussion of how they communicate. So they're really aware of the rules. They're really aware of any potential consequences. So of course, they are not like talking such explicitly, but they can use provocative arguments to lead toxic arise maybe by users itself. And this is really hard to detect, especially if that kind of conversation happen in the comment sections. So that doesn't mean that relatively low number of toxicity level means that the conversation was good, public discourse around European election was good. That's not the case. Second finding, I already anticipated a bit. We found really high difference in terms of engagement received by toxic comment, and that of course can be used as a strategy by the speakers, knowing that to drive any kind of reaction by the public. That of course can be also exploited by the recommender system. It's like a circle, in how to make effective strategies in this case. Beyond the relatively low level of toxicity, we found differences in countries, with Hungary and Poland the one who, in terms of absolute number and percentage, had the most number of toxic comment. And what were discussed in the toxic comment was mainly criticism around against any political adversaries, member of European Parliament, specific situation like Gaza and Israel, but also the war in the Ukraine was another topic, and also the criticism around Europe and Europe policy. So, what is the impact on elections? It's huge, of course, because beyond the physiological and natural development of language online, speakers that know how to use this toxic communication strategically, of course, will have an impact also in terms of amplification, of polarization, and a rising conflict between. So it has a huge impact. What we can do from our side as a researcher, I think, keep up with making clear and effective methodological approach. It's super important. Always being updated with the last model, the model that performs well. Of course, always kind of assessing qualitatively what the model says, not just taking it out. There's something I forgot to mention. It was really important in our methodological approach. Is super important. But of course, I believe, and we believe as the Democracy Reporting International, that in this case, part of the reason why we didn't see this toxic level so high was because probably the rules that are in place are starting to have an effect.
Right. So not that much toxic content overall still matters and can still be very dangerous if used by the wrong actors, or any actors really. So last, Nele, I was wondering to ask you. So we also, I don't think Micha talked about it. We talked about reasons why people decided to vote, but there was of course also the question, why didn't you vote, which actually concerned the majority of young people, as you saw. And one of the main reasons stated, around 22% or so of those who didn't vote say, I'm not interested in politics. Now, this doesn't mean and doesn't support the myth that there is all young people are like not interested in politics, apathetic. it is among those who didn't vote. However, it was kind of the biggest reason mentioned for not voting. So I'm turning to you as somebody working for things and working a lot on participation. What does that mean? Like, do we then need to concentrate on making young people more interested in politics, playing into that the long game, playing the long game, or is actually other things more important that we should be doing to get higher voter turnouts? Like, what are strategies we can think about? Or
Yes, thank you for the question, also for the presentation of the study so far and invitation. I think I still would want to begin with underlining again that young people are very much interested in politics, and I think it is nothing that we need to explain in this room, but probably to a lot of political actors that are out there, because what we're talking about now in this study, like 28% of the non-voters said that they were not generally interested so much in politics. But it's not necessarily the chunk of the stereotype that is often reproduced. It's actually hurtful for the political participation of young people. And so what I think I would definitely add to this, that young people are probably not using as much classical forms or formats of political participation anymore, so far, like party participation, but they're very interested in demonstrations, social media, petitions on the ground. And one way of, as you asked me, how to create more interest in politics by young people, I would say is kind of a mirror, in the sense of be more interested in young people, be more interested in what they're actually concerned about, hopeful about, what they are already doing. And this is a way to get to know driving their political participation. This can be also of acknowledging the way are not necessarily the classical forms, but the forms that participation so much in the classical context. And if you start to ask young people actually, what are you interested in? What is the political content that you would like to see? Then you need to also start make more relevant and appealing for young people. And I think I see mostly a lack of this, because young people are seen as a monolithic group and are seen as like those young people, and they are targeted with Interrail and Erasmus and apprenticeship and all these kind of things. But young people are heterogeneous, and they are also interested in political matters that are also important to the general population. And I think they need to be taken more seriously by political actors. And this will be also a way to, if you show the interest in young people, then the interest will also be growing from the other side, I would say. And maybe to add on the topics that we've seen also in the study is that young people are very concerned, or mostly around topic-related things are around economic inequality, healthcare, retirement system, climate change. These are all topics that also are resonating within the general population, but in a specific way with young people as well. I think your example with the housing crisis is also important, to see that young people probably would also like to see a concrete answer to this concern that they're sharing, and it needs to be seen in a livable neighborhood environment, not only like somebody talking on a video on, yeah, we're doing something against the housing crisis, but it needs to be seen like, where are you doing it, what are you doing exactly, and provide like a young people in a lived reality. And maybe one more thing, because it's concerning for me to see this, the fear of decline in future living standards. That's also quite high among young people, not only, but also among young people. And this adds to what you've been already underlining as well, that politicians need to create a vision that is more positive for the future, that is actually worthy enough for young people to be politics, and it needs to be creating like a better, maybe also emotional, toxic way, but on a more positive and emotional notion, creative future narrative that is creating also a vision for young people to. Yeah, it's good. Yeah, and this can also be done via social media, by the way.
Yes. So, of course, as it always is, I want to ask all these big questions, and we already take a lot of time to answer the first. So, what I suggest doing now is actually focus on the discussion and not try to go through all my questions. And then, in the end, have the speakers respond to any questions, comments directed to them, and give a small closing statement on policy. You all received the questions or what we can actually do about it, and then just close and take that discussion on the second question into the coffee break, into the cake. So, but now actually discuss. So this will be, so try to concentrate on 1-2 minutes in the end and addressing any comments in a sharp manner that you might get now in the next 10 minutes. So now it's on everybody else. I hope you have questions, concerns. Start there.
Thank you so much. My question is a bit on the type of algorithms that we see in social media. So while I do agree that provocative messages often get more engagement, I mean, we've seen a lot of studies on shock advertising and how stimulating they are. I was wondering if maybe the fact that algorithms put us in these information bubbles where we generally see narratives that reinforces our existing beliefs, whether this could be also one of the issues, because unless you're actively seeking to know about narratives that come from the other side, it's often hard to find out about them. So maybe that's one way. That's one thing that explains that even though, if I understood correctly, you said that far-right posts were less than others, they had more engagement. Maybe the idea is that also there's this issue of accessing the narratives of non-far-right posts.
Yeah, perfect. Let's first, anybody who wants to still to say something, even if it's a comment, if it's a question. Don't prove me wrong. Now we want to have a participatory discussion. Any other questions you might have on the algorithm? Yes, yes. I mentioned the thing, and then everybody was immediately. Yes. The example of. Yeah. Aoife.
Sorry, I have a question, even though
Absolutely.
I know. So I'm Aoife, I'm the communication officer here at FEPS. But more specifically, I'm also looking at the participatory communication model. I think this is all, I mean, working in social media is incredibly difficult from the perspective of a think tank. You deal with very deep, in-depth information. Getting that information across is quite difficult. So my question is probably more on like information sharing. How do we prioritize what information is important to get through to people? And I think that's something from our end. We do this all the time, trying to like reframe narratives, reshape what we're trying to tell people, and the main thing we want people to take away from social media posts. But I don't know, I'm opening the floor because I think it's another element of communication. What is the information, and how do we distill what information is really important to take away in amidst this trying to counter I think taking advantage of how easy the algorithm responds to negative and angry and inflammatory content.
Other questions, comments, takes?
Yeah, it's
You
not
can also
just-
say who you are. then we know.
not necessarily a question, just some reflections and comments that, you know, the narrative that is being created in social media is not only those who are representing parties and but also people, right? And I just want to bring up, I'm coming from Georgia, and currently you probably all know what we're dealing with. That and since I'm not in Georgia, I try to be active in social media, at least do something there. And personally, it's super difficult to deal with trolls and bots who are being paid, or they are like fake accounts, and then they spread all this toxicity. I mean, it's mentally really draining to deal with this. So I think that it's not only the representatives of political parties who create toxic environment in social media, but also this really large amount of paid trolls or bots or however. I don't know who is even behind those accounts. You know, I don't have expertise in that topic, but I think sometimes, especially in EU, I feel like we still underestimate the power of propaganda that is coming mainly from Russia and now in Georgia and so on. I don't have any expertise to propose solutions, but I feel this is a challenge in general, not only regards to young people, but how to fight against propaganda. Not only the political parties and their narratives in social media, but also these other schemes and mechanisms that they use to create feelings in general.
Just a small addition on that. I think it's also interesting to see in the violence of comments on posts, etc. There's a divide between countries. Because for the European election, we ran ads to get participation into YouHope, a big online consultation, and all of our national section did this in their own country, and it went perfectly fine in most of them. And then in Central Eastern Europe, they got 100 message of hatred per day on this. And it was the same ads, right? So it just translated into the national language. So it's the same content, and I would like to believe they were not all paid. So it's different with Georgia and propaganda and Romania. But I think it's also an interesting thing because in the study you go into different countries. So I was wondering if you also saw that.
All right, maybe we there. In terms of, I think I'll give a couple of these questions. I think they all connect best to what you can say about them, because you are much more an expert also on the digital democracy part of it, talking about that algorithms actually, what you're basically saying, they promote shocking things. So what do we do about it? Then also the examples shared from Georgia, where this is actually, you put kind of plastic, what's actually going on, and that's Georgia, but there's other countries, and you kind of confirming this from your own experience, reaching out. So the question, I think you can use it as a closing statement as well, because it plays well into the question I actually want to ask. What do we do in the next 5 years to actually create what I earlier said can be a much more level playing field, where it is not only toxicity that rules, it is now not only neither, but still we saw the problem and bots, etc. What can we do about it, also policy-wise, to also promote a more civil discourse? Then on the question on how to distill information, I mean, this is, it's a difficult one. And maybe, I mean, I was going to put the questions to you to just close a bit on the policies you would like to see for the next minute. Maybe you can, Ilana, you can go on that, because I suppose it's also for you, being the one having the transversal overview. Okay, what do you promote? Because the European Union is always doing so much also on news, but also take the policy angle. Answer that question a bit like, okay, how do you try as the institution distill, okay, this we put out, we don't try to shoot in all directions, let's say, but here's a couple of things, but also what the European Union is going to do on youth policy in the next 5 years. What is it going to prioritize to address some of the challenges, the concerns that we discussed? And then Nele, maybe you can come in the end and close, because we also know that the European Commission, with the political guidelines, etc. now, they try to push further this idea of also involving young people very structurally in policy dialogues. Now the president wants to have her, I believe now I'm messing it up, a sounding board or like a board for the Ursula von der Leyen, being advised by young people. So how do we ensure that some of this kind of how to bring in young people, actually listening to them, what I think Lauren was also saying, or you were saying, like listen to them and then the interest comes back. How can we make sure that the formats that will be created, we know they will, that they actually work, that they're not only symbolic? And then Lauren, also for you, maybe to prioritize one policy. If it was one thing, one area, okay, speak for the youth from now, or speak for yourself. What is the one thing that needs to be focused? I mean, I know there's many, and that's the thing with policies on young people. They are very transversal, right? And try to package all of this in your kind of closing statements of 2 minutes, and then we'll go to Anja, which is just going to say, have your cake and eat it.
So I'm not going to...
All right. Maybe we start with you, Francesca.
Yeah. It's not easy to address all these concerns, which are totally relatable, of course, and all valid, because everything that you brought up is absolutely true, and this is a long discussion going on. Like starting with the maybe talking about the as you said, as you mentioned, the echo chamber, the bubble you feel sometimes being trapped into. It's absolutely true. It's something that that platforms and in general AI, I would say also technology is struggling a lot with pursuing pluralism in general. We just published a report also highlighting how large language models are struggling in addressing this principle in general, because they are based on mechanism that basically privilege like the engagement by people that, as we've seen, sometimes or mostly comes for the most divisive content. Talking about what's the view on next year's, maybe it's more like on policy side, because I think it's the field that where we can really pursue goals and being a voice into the discussion. So for example, we make policy efforts as Democracy Reporting International to try to foresee and to reduce mitigation the risk of disinformation, of contamination in general of the public debate. So first, just list it out. We really do believe that, for example, a European Commission should increase the fundings for civic society organization, but also independent researchers in order them to make actionable research. And it's something that we really see the difference when you do like a narrative extensive report, or when you're a point, something happened and you're there and saying, look, we have to do this because this is the SA non-compliance, for example, and that it's more easy to get platforms being accountable in those cases. Secondly, something that really important that me as a researcher really close to, it's important to make clear guidelines on how to access public data, public available data under the Article 40 of the DSA, which is something really important because sometimes we rely too much on the what platforms do, and sometimes they have inconsistent approach. We saw CrowdTangle closing happen in August. Now there's this meta content library. We still need to face it. So there's a lot of things to do here. The DSA should be implemented also on territorial level through the coordinators, which are kind of that helps not having this feeling that the DSA comes from the sky, but also is actionable. It's something that really can be used in the reality. And of course, I believe that in general, in the especially also in the implementation of the AI Act, which came into force in August, but will actually be effective in 1-2 years. It's really important to put at the center the mitigation of risk on pluralism and the democratic processes. This is something that really need to focus on. I would love to see and say something more about the fake account and the murky account. Yeah, I would just really mention that it's something that we are currently monitor through different reports, not just in Meta product, but also on TikTok. And Romania, it's a really important case that maybe we can also discuss it later. Up to you, but I know. Sorry.
Just one response. There is a short version online already, which is 12 pages. Nice salmon colored box. It's not one, it has another picture, it looks similar, where it's very short. Second thing, HL. They're not going to be here on time with the report, which gives you a great that report. You're waiting here. Right, but from that we go to
best in 2-3 minutes. So first to say maybe in terms of youth policy, we'll continue to study this topic. I think and political participation of young people more. We have also funded research, maybe interested also for you, through the EU Council of Europe partnership, specifically on the vote at 16. So this is coming maybe in a month or something like that. There is a follow-up also going to be a survey. It's already processed by the European Parliament, specifically on the vote by young people. So these two research studies are coming out, and so you can also keep an eye on them. Many things, but okay, we have youth is remaining very high in this mandate. I mean, already with the European Year of Youth, we see there has been a change, but now in the new mandate of the Commission, we have our Commissioner for Intergenerational Fairness, Youth, Culture and Sport. And we see also how there is really youth mainstreaming is a priority. I mean, it's linked to what Nelia was saying, that it's not just young people, having a say on, education, Erasmus, etc., the future of the programs, but all the issues that concern them. So this is becoming more the norm, I think, which is very great. We've set up structures like the Commission Youth Network, where we have now nominated this year DG Youth correspondents. So in any area, whether you work in competition, in agriculture, etc., there is someone who owns this topic. Because we have to, and many of them often have like this also kind of a hat of communication and youth. So this is also good. I think we'll continue definitely to invest. I mean, it's not per se in youth policy, but citizenship education. Because no matter what we say, I mean, these messages on social media, etc., some people go after them and others don't. So there is an importance of citizen education also because it is, we're lucky in Europe that most young people, I mean, children go to school. So in terms of accessibility and reaching those groups that are really marginalized, you can do that in school. So I think this kind of digital skills and media literacy and just all of these topics have to be there. So that's a continued focus for us. On digital skills, maybe some of our strategies and the Better Internet for Kids strategy, the digital education plan, all this work is continuing. It's even more. I mean, we have guidelines for teachers on disinformation and misinformation, how to address it in school. So all of this is going on. And horizontally, I think on communication, we still need to learn. We find also that we are communicating these echo chambers, and someone talked about it in the algorithms. Also because, from Brussels, whatever you post, whatever account you're set up, I mean, of course, your messages are not going to reach, especially hard to reach groups. And I know the forum is also struggling with this. We are always talking. And I talked earlier how, in the European Youth Week, when we asked, people, will you vote? 90% said yes. And then it's what we had. So clearly there is a disconnect. And somehow from Brussels, we managed to talk to a specific bubble of young people who are already engaged and convinced that they don't even need more convincing. But it's very difficult from us centrally to reach to those who, So basically what we need is to rely on local partners. We are very convinced with, local youth organizations, national youth councils, and not only the youth bubble, municipalities, communities, schools, because it's only those people, youth workers on the ground that are very close to them that might have a chance of influencing them. And another thing is the peer-to-peer approach, which was mentioned so often. So if it is young people who are ambassadors and maybe are a bit more knowledgeable going into their communities and speaking about these topics, there would be much more believable than a Commission or Biljana or whoever at this level. So yeah, thank you.
But one part of shameless self-advertisement, because you said it, the keyword, we have a report laying outside. There's only 2 copies, but it's online as well, on disadvantaged young people and democracy, what they think about it, how to better reach them. It's there on the table and online. But with that, I want to lead over maybe to Lauren to let's try to stick to the 2 minutes so people can have their cake on the one policy that we should focus on.
Okay, so I had something completely different prepared, but I think considering I would go back to the data, which is that young people telling us the biggest thing that they care about right now is the economy. So lack of access to quality jobs, lack of good working conditions. And I would raise a few policies that the European Youth Forum has part of one package, but multiple policies. which is things like a strengthened youth guarantee, making sure that that's working correctly in every member state. Having finally an end to unpaid internships, which is a really discriminatory practice for people's entry into the labour market. And a minimum income scheme as well is something that we advocate for, which hopefully should address that one topic that was at the forefront of many young people's minds. A short plug, Eurodesk, for the question about what kind of information we need and how to transmit it to young people. I would really recommend checking out Eurodesk's work because they're really experts in providing information in good and engaging formats to young people. Don't feed the trolls. Talking about cake makes me think of Brexit. I spent many hours feeding the trolls on Brexit. Don't recommend it because it actually increases the exposure and the kind of engagement level. And a takeaway for the next 5 years, maybe beyond the economic policies, is I think really making sure that DSA is implemented correctly. There's actually quite a lot of good stuff in there around content systems. We tried to push for young people to be able to reset their feeds and algorithms, which I think would contribute to this kind of not getting stuck into a bubble. Didn't quite get that, but we did get along with many other NGOs, the third party recommender system. So DSA, make sure it happens.
Thank you a lot. And Nele, maybe just a couple of words on, we know there will be more formats even than before and involving young people structurally in the Commission specifically. How can we make sure those don't remain symbolic but actually have an impact?
I will try to be really short on this. I think it's a good start. It's a good start of dialogue and participation and getting young people's perspective inside the Commission, but it's mostly this way up. No, it's the way from young people's ideas and opinions, and then they are transferred to the Commission to be informed. But I think these kind of formats are not necessarily felt by most young people on the ground. They will not know that somebody is in Brussels and speaking or something. So actual youth participation needs to be happening on the local level, and I can just agree to what you've been saying. However, these formats need to have like clear management of expectation, how much of it will be implemented, and so that young people will not be frustrated afterwards. We're already telling what we want, and then this is not happening. I think this is one very important part, and then also like how to be very inclusive and diverse, not only in sense of countries involved, but also socioeconomic backgrounds or disadvantaged groups, because whose perspectives are actually involved or whose perspectives are not. And not more to this, so I keep it short. Thank you.
Well, I felt like I have been a little bit censored by saying, it's a cake, so you need to invite people for the cake, but I still will resist that temptation. And just want to say a few words of what I think has been an incredibly interesting debate. Number one, some ages ago, namely 20 years ago, I was getting to be elected as Secretary General of the Young European Socialists. And funny enough, that's only 1 year after Facebook was invented, because it has just celebrated 20 years. And I can't believe that 2 decades later, we're coming back to the table and we're saying, social media, it's such an innovative way of participatory democracy. I mean, where on earth have we been for the last 20 years and why we are so surprised? And I think that brings me to the 5 very short points I want to make at the end. Number one, why democracy doesn't work? Because democracy doesn't work for everyone. I think if we look at the number of protests across the world nowadays, the amount of the intensification after the especially financial crisis shows that we are in the point that historically could be even compared to 1848 or 1968. So we are having some sort of a democratic revolution with a lot of protests. I mean, the current generation is being marked about, what about climate? What about democracy? What about all those different things? And I think if we want democracy to work, it's not about here quick fix or saying this is where the end of pluralism is, but it's about making democracy and social contract work for different people. Then democracy is resilient. And on that point, I would say, we are saying, okay, what buys young people and so on. I'm still an optimist. Maybe that's what makes me stay for so long with social democratic movement. But I do believe that the societies and especially young people are much more progressive than we would like to believe. So when we are looking about, the toxic content and so on, we are all about protection instead of actually embracing, because young people are having a very specific vision about the future, and they are not shy in expressing that. We are just very good at taming those, because the rest of the society must be upheld. Point number 2 I want to make is following. How do you encourage more votes? That was the thing. I think you start from not stigmatizing. I mean, I hate this conversation about why young men now vote for the right wing and young women not. So what are we going to do? In case of the pollsters telling us that, we're going to run all to sort of court young men to come back to the Social Democratic Party, leaving all the other issues behind. Is that a good way forward? Absolutely not. So I think not stigmatizing, but also thinking in a more sort of, if you want, building collective perspective is the way forward. And I think we should not be scared. This is the tendency like any others. And, we cannot condemn voters for making their choice. We want to make them make the choice. We just have to get a little bit better. Number 3, I think we need to be a little bit more nuanced. I think we're saying, there are a little bit of the learning points from the right wing and so on. I almost feel like we are jealous that, that they are so good at the different things. It's not about beating them at their own game. It's about redefining the rules of the game. And that's much more difficult than sort of trying to be authentic and so on. You make the point about being liked. Nobody votes for people just because they are likable. They vote for people because they are credible. And this is the credibility of politics that we need to build. And that will translate much more than if we start, I don't know, playing chess on social media and pretend that this is the coolest thing in the world to do. 2 more things I want to do. Many of you represent the youth organizations, and I think that you are equally under pressure as the political parties. The format of political participation has been changing, but the role of the political youth organization is still considered to be the juniors. I think one of you mentioned lack of the young candidates on the list and lack of credibility. There will not be young candidates on the list if we don't have more young people. I was in this position 20 years ago. By that time, nobody cared about the youth votes. You needed to kick open the door. And I think we are similarly in this situation. Nothing will be given, but we need to have the aspirations, and the youth organizations have to be playing the pivotal role. And last but not least, I think there needs to be a way in changing. I have been given the last word, and I'm behaving like a typical social democrat, saying I will be short and taking the floor like forever. But I do think that we need to change the language as well. I hate when we are discussing we will target young people. It's not a military operation. I mean, we need to engage with young people. And as long as we say we will communicate at young people, craft messages at young people, which is, by the way, a very diverse group with very different aspirations, we are always going to be at the losing end. Engaging, getting into the dialogue, and not being so much afraid what the young people want to tell us, even if it's going to be hurtful. I think that's the way forward. Otherwise, no revolution will be done. With that, there is a cake to sweeten the bitter pill at the end. But before we go, I'd like to thank fantastic speakers who have been given a massively difficult task of, encompassing massive knowledge in just 2-3 minutes, and they have successfully done so. Leaving us with at least 3-4 pertinent ideas to poke around before we go. I'd like to thank Mikael, Elena, and Matteo, who have been the guardians of this phenomenal work. And I think that Biljana's work were very important. This is the start of the conversation, not the end. But this fantastic meeting with your participation wouldn't have happened if not a fabulous operational arm behind, Caitlin, who has been mailing many of you, and also in the spirit of, we sustain, we build resilience democracy, we show that something positive can happen, such as this constructive debate. Aoife and Morgana and also Ainara, who had been here, have been making sure to take record and make us famous across the social media, at least within our own bubbles. And with that, I'm happy to close for the cake.